Hello everyone, I'm Jonathan, also known as the Medieval Genie, and today we're going to be talking about thrusting weapons and why the ability for any weapon to thrust is such an extreme advantage. Now, if we look at different weapons throughout history, whether we're talking about swords, hatchets, polearms, other sorts of things used for close combat, there is quite a significant portion of them that can thrust, including modifications on items that would not. For example, on the poleaxe, when you see a top spike, you see that it then has a modification to a sort of a core design, so that it can thrust. So let's look at the reasons why. So, obviously, it goes without saying that if you take a weapon that can thrust, then that gives you more options. If I take a weapon like this, so here's one, a machete, here's one I made earlier. So with a machete, of course, it is, in an improvised circumstance, a good weapon. That's why in many countries up to and including modern times, people use machetes, because they are decent for cutting. This one I've made is quite a short example, but they can come in all sorts of shapes and sizes. Of course, they're usually quite forward-weighted. They are of a sort of sword-like design, so a long blade with an edge all the way along, compared to an axe, where of course it's all focused at the head, and can potentially be upwards of 20 inches long in the blade, or down to potentially, almost a knife-sized blade, depending on the individual examples. But overall, with machetes, they tend to be broad at the top, single-edged, forward-weighted, and of course, versatile tools and weapons. So with a machete, of course, I can perform hefty sort of chopping actions. If I can do slicing actions. I can perform many different actions that work in some sort of close combat. However, this may sound controversial, but unlike what zombie movies would teach you, machetes are not necessarily the be-all and end-all weapon. And you should always bear in mind that when people use these sorts of weapons for violence, they're usually using what's available to them. It's kind of like how ridiculous it is that sometimes when you talk about a hypothetical apocalypse scenario, you'll eventually find someone who says, well, the kind of weapon I'll have a light machine gun, or a rocket-propelled grenade launcher. Well, good luck with that, but in real life, most of us don't have that sort of crap. So, just as much as a lot of violent crime in the United Kingdom is committed with things like claw hammers and kitchen knives, so in certain exotic territories you might see crimes with knives, but also with things like the machete. So if we're talking about a variety of weapons, and you're not restricted to only using things like machetes, then we can look at alternatives such as a Falcata. Here's one I made earlier. So with the Falcata, I'm choosing this deliberately because it is similar in design and style to something like a machete. It is, again, single-edged, forward-weighted, tends to be quite broad and more choppy towards the tip, so not just a bit, potentially, in terms of thickness and other factors. It might keep a consistent thickness or have what's called a distal taper, where it starts thicker towards the handle, thinner towards the tip. You've got that breadth, and you can see this sort of design. There is a slight forward curve, which is to make it more indicative of that Falcata style when I forged it. But it has most of those same slicing and chopping features. So the key difference here that makes it a proper sword and something that's, in my opinion, a far superior weapon is that it has a sharp point. So if I show you closer up here, you'll notice that unlike certain machetes, which can sometimes sort of curve and taper down, and actually can get some machetes with thrusting points, it should be noted, but we're talking broadly in general here. With something like a Falcata, it's got a deliberate thrusting point. So without really sacrificing much in terms of cutting power, only from my experiments using these sorts of weapons in test cutting against tree branches or plastic bottles or any other resistant materials, typically you only notice a slight loss of cutting power right at the very tip, and you tend to get kind of a grazing, so you kind of scratch. You know, if you're talking, you're only cutting in the last inch or half an inch of the blade, and you're really not measuring yourself properly, so you know you're cutting at a distance where you're going to make at best a shallow cut anyway, even if it was a lightsaber and could go through anything. In that very tip, that's where it doesn't have as much cutting power as something that keeps a broad blade right to the very tip, like this designer machete I have here. So for such little loss, what you gain from that is that you can do all sorts of things. For starters, like I said earlier, you can just thrust. It means that you can do the slice, you can do the chop, you can do the stab. Obvious. What's not so obvious is that it provides you with tactical options. Now, if you're up against someone who has some sort of swinging weapon, such as a club, a hammer, or a machete, one of the things you can do, obviously there are always risks involved in doing anything in close combat, and it's a chaotic thing, and real life never gives you, you know, a video game style simple resolution, but usually you have the opportunity at some point against a swinging weapon where you can close distance. So let's say someone is about to swing down and go like that, so they're going to swing down and chop perhaps towards your head to split it open, let's be honest. So in that moment, if you were unarmed or had some sort of short weapon and wanted to close distance, you can close in and try to grab the weapon itself before it's swung too much and is, you know, I should probably explain, with swinging dynamics, a moving weapon with an edge does cut, but the best part of cutting is usually, if I'm cutting towards you, it's by about here, this sort of arc here. I've geared my body to swing through, and there is some cutting here before and here afterwards, but the majority of the good cutting happens here, where I'm actually aiming for. So if you catch prematurely, even if you're catching dangerously and injure yourself on the edge, you are still doing better than just receiving the full brunt of it, even beyond the force. But if you've done it well enough, you may not even be catching on the edge at all. You catch on the handle of the weapon, perhaps short on the blade, or an area that's like a ricasso where it's blunt instead of sharpened. You may even catch the person's hand or forearm, stop them, and potentially look at disarms, takedowns, and all sorts of things I won't cover today. If you want to look at close combat in that grappling sense, I would recommend looking at things like judo, Krav Maga, MMA, and all those sorts of things. But with that, it gives you that opportunity where you can close in and perform grappling actions. With a thrusting weapon, this is entirely different. When you've got that sort of idea, you can instead threaten the opponent with the point. So if I have a Falcata, for example, or even a knife like, say, this one I made earlier. This is kind of like a camping knife. Excuse me, so you'll see it's single-edged and it has a clip point, so it does thrust and stab if required. Not that I hope to do so. But it means that if someone threatens to get close to me, there is the obvious threat for them that I may just stab them. And when it comes to a thrusting attack, it is one of the most effortless things in the world. I mean, if I'm using something to chop, I need to gear my body, so I need a lot of movement room. I need to prepare a swing. I need to get the edge alignment, so if I'm off a bit too much, and you'll see this with people who do test cutting, like I do against plastic bottles, people who are brand new, when they cut, the edge of the blade might be slightly off, and it suddenly makes a massive difference in the cut. So I've got to do all that. I've got to prepare. I might also want to add some force, so I'm going to do, I've got the force from the arm, the force around the shoulders, the force from taking the step, and also just physically sort of lunging forward and going towards you. This is creating that power in a cut. With a knife, or with a sword, or with a spear, when you have the point, you can do all of those things to help you, but in reality, it's very simple to just push through. Think in the same way as walking or sitting on a nail. It's that same thing, but with an even more fine and deliberately designed to stab type of point. So with that, I don't really need all this swinging room. I don't need to kind of almost, well, maybe not flail around. Good cutting isn't flailing, but I don't need to do all of this movement and action. Instead, all I need, and I've done this in what I call the walk test with different swords. My last video, using a short sword, I just braced the blade against the chest like this, and I walked towards the target, and then it just pushed the blade. So I'm just going at this normal walking pace. I didn't run, I didn't thrust out of my hand, I kept it all completely still, walked into it, and I pierced through the bottle. The point I'm making here is that with that, it is an extremely effortless thing to do. All it needs is, it could even happen by accident. You don't even have to deliberately thrust with a point of a knife or sword or spear or something. All you need is for it to be pointed in the right direction towards an opponent who's charging at you, or perhaps towards someone who is falling on top of you, and that point goes into them under the sheer force of gravity, walking into you, brushing up against you, any of that stuff. It's very effortless. And so much so, actually, it should be noted, I don't know how many of you watch real life fights, you know, things where people have been perhaps assaulted or murdered, but it should be noted that sometimes people don't even notice when they've been stabbed. You know, there's a lot of reaction to being punched, to being, you know, hit with something like a machete or an axe. That with something like a stab, sometimes the person who is on the receiving end does not even know it has happened because there's so little resistance. It's just a very gentle push, and that's it. You know, I could go against like this with my hand right now. I won't, obviously, but I could just have that kind of force, and I could pierce this knife all the way through me, really. It's that kind of effortlessness. So compare that to cutting, it's a lot less lethal. So if we look at this meat cleaver that I forged earlier, so if we look at these two, if you're talking about certain video games and, you know, sort of fictional representations, you would see someone being represented as deadlier wielding something like this, the meat cleaver. It is heavier, it is more forward weighted, it has obviously a good chopping edge, it's broad. Certainly I've done from test cutting and things using this meat cleaver, it cuts far superior to this knife, even though the blade is slightly longer, and typically longer blades are better for cutting, but regardless, this cutting edge performs fantastically. It's one of the earliest blades that I ever made that cut really well. However, if you ask me which of these two was the better weapon, I would actually say this knife. Because with this knife, yes, it cuts, but with, you know, without having some sort of thrusting point, this meat cleaver is at a severe disadvantage. It can only cut. That is it. It can chop like a hatchet, it can slice like a knife you expect would, but it does not thrust. So hence, as I'm, you know, it's almost like a skipping rope with closing in again, like I mentioned earlier. You can time it to actually close in and disarm, take down, do an arm lock, all of those things. Whereas, with something that has a point, like the knife, there is no opening. I have the point towards the opponent at some point. Even if I'm retracted back and I don't want to expose my arm to being struck or being grabbed, and I have it more close to my body, perhaps I'm ready to get into a grappling range myself. With this point, it means that I have the option to keep that threat 100% of the time. I could take a weapon perhaps more sword length, like this Spartha type thing that I made, and I could just simply threaten the opponent. If I see someone and I just want to threaten them with the point, I can keep it towards them the entire time. Even if they wish to swing and bat me out of the way, I can just lower the point. So they're swinging here, I lower it so I don't get beaten out of the way. But notice, even if I drop my arm, Here, I'm pointing at your face. Here, I'm pointing at your face. Over here, I'm pointing at your face. And from here, and from here, and from here. All of these sorts of positions, I can keep a constant and consistent threat. Whereas you cannot do that with swinging actions. You can be in a ready position so that it takes less time. This is the contrast between people who don't understand fighting and will start something like this, relaxed, and then back, swing, instead of starting ready, swing, so it takes a lot less time to perform a cut. But even with that good quality cut, I still need to go from here to here. There is that time, there is a delay, whether it is minimal or a lot. There is something that has to be, there is a time where I am not hitting you. Whereas with the point, obviously, as soon as you walk onto that point or run into it, whatever happens, the moment you touch the point and are advancing forward, it is immediately doing harm, instantly, without delay. This is why a lot of blades have points on them. Now, I've talked about swords, of course, because it is what I know best in the martial arts that I've done, and also what people like a lot. I mean, you think about King Arthur, he didn't have a spear, he had a magic sword. There's a reason why swords are this sort of grandiose, noble weapon. But even if we talk outside of swords, I've mentioned you've got things like spears, which are inherently designed for thrusting, but you can also have things like certain war axes, you know, hatchet types of length, single-handed weapons, which have forward spikes on them in some cases. On top of that, you can have things like the poleaxe, which again has a hatchet on the front, a hammer on the back, and usually a spike at the top. You also look at other weapons, like certain maces and morning stars and things, they have sometimes top spikes. Certain designs of warhammers. You can find a lot of different items which have that thrusting capability. And it should be noted as well that even in a situation where you look at perhaps a warhammer or something that does not have a thrusting point on it for whatever reason, even in those cases where they don't have their primary or initial weapon for thrusting, they usually have some sort of backup item, which would be something like a dagger or knife by their side, which they can use for thrusting at some point if they need to. So even when it looks like, oh no, these people don't use thrusting weapons, actually they do. So yeah, like I've said, with those sorts of advantages, it gives a lot of help. And you might be thinking, I know some people don't know about half-swording, which I'll explain in a minute, you might think that perhaps with a larger, more supposedly cumbersome weapon, this advantage is lost when closing into a close distance. So in a distance where I'm perhaps about to grapple with someone and I don't have the room to swing a sword because this sword needs room to swish and slash about, that when we get close, oh well, it's going to be awkward to try and thrust of it. You are wrong. There is something called half-swording. So, if you don't know what it is, you take the weapon, you just grab it somewhere along the blade, close to the tip, closest to the handle. There's no real hard law about this. You just choose what you feel comfortable with or wish to do in that particular moment. And then with that, you basically shorten your sword into a kind of spear. This can be used for things like parrying actions and other things as well, and also positioning ready for other attacks. But in this sort of situation, when we're talking about thrusting weapons, I'm mentioning it because you can immediately use it in close combat. So perhaps trying to angle it like this and stretch your arm out is impractical. And also with one arm like this, there is the potential to get grappled. Let's say I want to stab like that from above, and someone just puts their arm in the way, into my elbow, and I'm trying to thrust. It's not really working, I can't get the strength in, and it's difficult. However, half sword, none of this happens. Someone tries to grab me, when I've got the leverage of both arms, I can just try to get my way out of it. Or even I could, for example, try to twist my way out of it. I could push aside and thrust under. I can do various actions. I could even use the back of the sword, hit the pommel, There are loads of different choices you get, but my point is, you are not necessarily rendered useless if your thrusting weapon that's quite long and has good reach suddenly ends up in a very short space. I can still comfortably thrust. I mean, if I take this and half sword now, this sword has a 21-inch blade. I can take it now, and I can easily use that in a 1-inch space. I could be right up hugging distance, but a much more deadlier hug with my opponent, and I can do what I need. I could even choke it up right next to the tip. Like I said, there's no hard and fast rules, so in the absolute most tight spaces, you can still use longer thrusting weapons in a short space. You can't say that about swinging weapons. The best you can do with those sorts of swinging weapons is try to position it and then perform a draw cut. This is possible, but it is a lot harder and tends to cause less injury to the foe. So there we are. Like I said, thrusting weapons are fantastic, which comes with the caveat therefore that, well, not the caveat, the additional point therefore that no, machetes are not the best zombie apocalypse weapons. They are good if that's what you have in your tool shed, instead of getting your chains caught up in a chainsaw or trying to use a garden rake or something. But if you're looking at actual bladed weapons, something like a sword will do better. Even, and most especially, a direct upgrade to something like a kukri knife, which has a thrusting point, or a Falcata, which has a thrusting point. So, that is it for today. If you have any requests for topics, I'm more than happy to discuss them, assuming they're relevant and I know enough about them. And that's it. Ta-ra for now.